Welcome to this published author's interview. My name is Kenneth Muyingo, and with me I have a special guest that I'm going to be interviewing. First, I just want to mention, if you watch this interview and you would like to write a book, to become an author yourself, there is a link with this interview for you to join the group, become an author and write your first book, to connect with like-minded people who are doing the same. And with that said, I would like to get into the interview by asking my guest to say hello to our viewers and listeners and to introduce himself.
Okay. Hi there, my name is Alex Pearl. I'm not really I don't regard myself as a professional writer. I've written two books, and for many years I was an advertising copywriter in London. And I suppose now that I've retired, I thought it would be a good opportunity to write a bit. So I've written my first full-length novel quite recently, beginning of the year. In 2011, I published my first work of fiction, which was I suppose it was a novella. Really, it was aimed at children and young adults, primarily for my own kids, actually. But I'm set out on this path of writing, which hopefully will continue for some years through my retirement. I'm enjoying it. And I suppose, for many years I toyed with the idea of writing, but never did. Probably. I think it was probably a confidence thing. I think anyone who toys with the idea of writing feels that they probably don't have a book in them, and they put it off. They procrastinate like I do, and I'm a terribly slow writer. I'm not. When I take my hat off to people who write for a living, because I'm not that disciplined. I'm actually I'm pretty shambolic, really, and it takes a lot of energy to start a book, and I'm slow. I'm the first one. I'm a slow writer, and I go backwards and forwards, and but I enjoy the process. But it's taken a long time. It's taken all these years for me to start writing, but I'm enjoying it. It's not easy, but I'm enjoying it. I think that's the key. I think you've got to enjoy what you do.
Most definitely.
Yeah. But
you think you're a copywriter, right? You were a copywriter for...
I was a copywriter for, let me think, I've lost count. I mean, it must have been over 35 years or something like that. I went to art school back in the distant mists of time, and I think it must have been 1979, something like that. And my academic background's not that impressive. I was never great at school. I was lousy, in fact. I didn't read much. I was quite good at art, and that's what I ended up doing. I went to art school. I got in at the very last minute, and I sort of got interested in advertising and writing, and that's how I got into it, really. I teamed up with a good friend, and we got in as a creative team, and I suppose that opened my eyes to writing, and because I suppose that's a very short form of writing. There is a craft to creating creative copy, and it's actually quite useful for a writer to have that. And also, I suppose in advertising, it's quite a good training for people who are also into filmmaking, because the short form of storytelling is actually it's quite a good discipline, actually, for both filmmakers and writers. So it was quite a good grounding, and it sort of, it interested me in writing. And I came across people who were very, very good writers. I mean, my first boss in 1980, a man called Ken Mullen, was highly literary figure. He had 2 degrees from Oxford University in English literature. He was very well read. He encouraged everyone to read, till the cows come home. And he was a very good influence, I think. And it was it shaped me. I think when you come into that sort of environment, and you know sort of people, you really do benefit from that. And I suppose from that early period, I was interested in certainly reading and writing, but it took me many years, as I said, to actually sit down and
Do it
start
yourself.
writing. And the first attempt at doing it was actually, I was working. I remember it was probably about 2007, something like that. And I started writing this very long, rambling novel. And I wrote about, let me think, must have been about probably maybe 10, 12, 13,000 words, something like that.
Yeah.
And then it was an experiment, because I had no plan in my head. It was kind of sort of stream of consciousness type stuff.
Yeah.
And it was and I think I've lost it now, but and I got to the point where I just didn't know where it was going anymore. And my daughter read it and kept saying to me, "You've got to finish this, Dad. It's great." I mean, and I thought, and I tried to sit down and methodically work out like a storyline for it, and it was really difficult. And I found it really hard, and I couldn't resolve where it was going to go, and nothing really kind of satisfied me as a storyline. But in the end, I just put it down. I said, "Look, I just put it to one side." And then about must have been 4 years later or so, I had this other idea. I had an idea that came to me, and I sat down for some while and I worked out an idea, and it was for a children's book, a sort of middle grade novella. And I sat down and I spent a long time actually working out the plot. And I was still at work. I remember it was quite surreal, because I was working at the time at a very strange, it was an advertising going through a very strange period where they were being merged. It was a company called Draft, who are based, they no longer exist. They were based in Chicago, and I was in the London office. And they were being merged with New York's, one of their oldest advertising agencies, called FCB, Foot Cone Belding. Yeah. And the merger was surreal. It was a global merger. Can you imagine? All these companies had lots of different companies all over the world. They were merging all of them into one huge thing, and it was a nightmare. And so this went on for about a year. And during the year, nobody knew whether their jobs were going to be secure, and people were sort of phoning their headhunters. And anyway, and the bizarre thing was there was no work. I mean, during this year, there was absolutely no work. And the creative director who I was working for had been sort of ostracized and shoved to one side. And it was a very strange situation. So I thought, well, bugger this, I'm just going to do something in my time. And I had this idea from this book, and I started writing it in the office. So for a year, by the time they made me redundant, I'd finished it. And that was Sleeping with the Blackbirds. That was my first book. And so
that's the title. What's the title again?
Yeah, the title is Sleeping with the Blackbirds. It's a kind of difficult book to categorize. It was a sort of fantasy. People call it an urban fantasy, but it's kind of, I suppose it is in a way. It's difficult, but my intention was, I suppose, to write a book that had a very old-fashioned and sort of whimsical kind of feel to it, that was very English, but also set in the modern day, and sort of encompassed, modern technology, the internet, and all that, everything that we're used to. That was my intention. I wanted it to be quite an old-fashioned book. I suppose it's influenced by a lot of writers. People like P.G. Wodehouse and Roald Dahl, people like that. Traditional sort of old-fashioned, right? Sort of, that was my intention, and I enjoyed writing it. And it's a mixture of black humor and also quite serious subjects like bullying and homelessness and the cult of celebrity, stuff like that. And it's in this kind of I suppose there's a little bit. It's got a bit of magic realism in that fact that you've got birds who can you can hear their thought processes and stuff like that. So it's a kind of it's slightly magical as well. So it's quite it's quite
Amazing.
a mishmash of stuff.
Amazing.
But yeah, so that, I mean, I enjoyed writing that, and I finished it, and I published that, and so that got the ball rolling, as it were. So
Wow. I
yeah,
find it
but
really interesting because, like what you mentioned, that during this time that this merger was going on and there was like sort of a redundancy in the workplace,
yes,
it sort of looks like the time that we're currently in right now with the
it was, I suppose. I mean,
coronavirus,
this was,
and many people are uncertain about their work situations.
yeah, it
And
was,
most people find themselves with extra time on their hands. And I think
yes,
what you did is
yes,
very productive, that you just put this time to productive use and you did this thing that you
yeah.
felt in your heart. But I'm curious, when you made the decision to do it, um, what would you say inspired you most as far as choosing the topic for the book? Because when I like what you say, that you sort of find it hard to categorize it, but
Yes,
in a way, when I listen to your description, you have categorized it.
yes, I suppose I have. Yes.
What inspired you to write this book?
um, Well, I suppose, I mean, I've always toyed. I was toying with the idea of writing something, and I mean, as I said earlier, the hardest thing I think of any kind of writing of any story is to actually formulate, for me, formulating a story that kind of works for me. I mean, that's the hardest thing.
Yeah,
The writing of it is relatively easy, but the plotting of it I find the most challenging and difficult. But what inspired me, I suppose there's probably a number of, I mean, going back, I mean, there's no one thing, and there's probably several factors. I mean, when I was at school, I think one of when I was in secondary school, I had an amazing teacher, and a lot of people say this. I think you know, it's a lot of these influences go back to when we study. And I had a teacher at secondary school, a man called Clive Lawton, who was really quite remarkable because he had an affinity with the kids, and he knew how to grab your attention.
yeah,
He was an English teacher, and he would just be incredibly revolutionary in the way he taught. I mean, he was on our wavelength, and he would say things like, "Oh, why are we doing this syllabus? It's boring. It's hopeless. What it's it's dreadful. What?" And then it's like tear stuff up and just say, "Right, we're going to do something interesting now." And he'd just turn everything on its head. And basically, he was, he was. He wanted to convey to his students, the importance of words and the power of words, and he did it by really engaging us in dialogue about all sorts of subjects.
yeah,
And he would do things that were just totally unconventional. For example, he would come into the classroom and say, "Right, today I'm not going to mark your essays, you're going to mark mine." And he'd bring in a pile of his old essays and give them to us, take home and mark them, So he basically turned everything upside down. And it was a fantastic way of engaging the kids and he was also an amazingly larger than life personality, very large, booming voice,
yeah,
and very charismatic. And he was just an incredible teacher because you looked forward to the lessons. You didn't know what was going to happen.
exactly.
Everything was going to be a surprise. And it worked because every kid in that class did incredibly well, and they passed their exams, their O-levels, with I think there was nothing lower than a B. And he did that by completely ignoring the syllabus. So he was a very revolutionary, unusual teacher. He
Amazing.
went on to do great things. He went into education, and then he made a name for himself. But he was certainly a teacher that influenced me early on, and I think I suppose he probably influenced me and went into writing as a copywriter because became interested in words and in writing. So that was hugely influential early on, I think. Then later on, I'd meet people like as I said, this chap who was my boss, my first boss, who was very influential, Ken Mullen, who was he was the only copywriter to this day in the UK that has been quoted in the Oxford Book of Quotations.
Wow.
For some of his work. So yeah, he used to work, I think, at Leo Burnett's probably in the 60s, and he wrote a lot of work for a lot of ads for the Times newspaper. And I think that there were two lines that got into the Book of Quotations. One was "Our sages know their onions," and another one was "No pomp, just circumstance."
Wow.
And that was another. So there were two headlines that were quoted in the the Oxford English Book of Modern Quotations, I think it is. Yeah.
Oh.
So yeah, and he was you know, he was just, and he was also very funny, very funny man, and he put you at ease. You know, he wore his intelligence lightly, and he was very likable, and you know, because some of these characters can be a bit, you know, formal and a bit daunting, but he wasn't like that at all. You know, he was great fun. But so yeah, so that he was I think influential, and I think then later on I met someone who another copywriter actually, who was a very talented creative writer and encouraged me to write stories. Actually, sadly he died, and I think the fact that he died tragically was also, when I look back on it, quite influential, because I think in some respects I kind of think, well, maybe I'm writing in honor of him and his memory, because he was very talented actually, and he wrote a lot of nice short, you know, really quite striking short stories. Yeah, so the combination of people, I think, and I think you know, inevitably it rubs off on you, you know. So
amazing.
I guess that's why, rather late in the day, I'm writing now.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah,
It's quite. Yeah. I like how you draw from different stages of your life journey. That it looks like in every stage there's been a significant person that has had a great impact on your life, and sometimes it takes us looking back with awareness to just see who those people are and the impact that they had on our lives.
Yeah, yes, I think so.
Like
the other thing
about the teacher.
And there's one other story I'll before I forget, which also I think was also probably had quite an influence on me actually, was when I was working for this chap Ken Mullen. They did a lovely press campaign for real fires, so that people could have real fires in their houses, you know, and they had this very simple idea, which was to approach well-known writers to write a piece, and they were going to design it like editorial, and it was just called "Pictures I See in My Fire," and then it was just down to them to write, you know, like 2,000-3,000 words about anything, about real fires and what it meant to them. And they had, I think, I'm trying to think, they had Frederick Raphael, who's an English, they're all English writers, he's a playwright, Charlotte Bingham, who's a novelist, and then Beryl Bainbridge, the late Beryl Bainbridge, who's a wonderful writer, and she wrote an amazing sort of autobiographical piece about herself, about her childhood, and it was absolutely brilliant. And it was very long. It was about 4,000 words or something, and they printed the thing as a full page. It was all text and one little picture at the bottom, and it looked like editorial. Didn't look like an advert. And it won. It was probably 1986 or something, and it won. It won for the advertising awards. The biggest one in the UK is called the D&AD, British Design and Art Directors Association. It's very well respected worldwide, and they won the silver medal for the best copy, best written advert for that year in any publication. And it was written by Beryl Bainbridge. My boss had the idea for doing it, but his only contribution was the words "Pictures I See in My Fire." And then the like 5,000 words, whatever it was written by Beryl Bainbridge. And I had the pleasure of going to the awards ceremony and actually sitting next to her.
Wow.
And now that I look back on it, I think she was quite, well, it was only just an hour or whatever, a couple of hours. It was, it was quite an experience, because I was sitting next to a really well-known, successful British author.
Wow.
And she was chatting away, and I was chatting. She was chatting to me and asking me these questions, and I thought, this is incredible. What an amazing thing to be able to do for a living. And she was fascinating, and also she would, every few minutes, she would produce a notebook. She'd ask you something, and then she said, "Oh, and tell me about this." And as you're writing, she'd write it down. And how do you spell that? It was extraordinary. And I think, she would take her notebooks everywhere. She'd write down notes, and so, like dreams that evaporate. She had this idea that she had to get it on paper, and I think a lot of writers who are serious writers do that. And it struck me as, sort of quite incredible that I was actually sitting there, and I suppose she inspired me really to probably. Looking back on it, I didn't realise it at the time, but I think it was quite inspirational to sit next to her. Actually, she had a lot of energy, and so that probably also influenced me. When you see writers that close up, it inspires you to write, to have a go. So that I think also helped influence me. I hadn't thought of that until now.
Quite special. Like I'm reminded of something I had sometime, that when we let our light shine, we unconsciously give other people permission to let their light also shine. And I think it's a very good illustration with what you're saying, that you just being in her presence and just interacting with her, sparked up something within you.
And she was very normal. I mean, the thing about it was, like, I suppose the fact that she was so normal, and you have a normal conversation with her, and you forget who she was. That you think,
exactly,
she's a human being, and she's an amazing writer, but she communicates like anyone else. And as far as she was concerned, there was nothing special about her, and she was delightful. She was absolutely delightful to talk to, and very and when you speak to someone, I think, well, maybe I should have a go. Maybe I could, just gives you. I think it just inspires you, really.
It does.
Something like that.
And I think that's the beauty of human interaction. That the more we connect with other people, you never know. At the end of the day, we are all looking for inspiration or enlightenment, if we could say. And in the process of us interacting with others, one of the reasons I enjoy doing these interviews is interactions like this. They spark up new ideas and thoughts within me, and I know that even our viewers and listeners also get that value from the messages that I receive as far as this is. I'm curious, so you mentioned when you finished to write this first book, before that, there was a story that you had written and shared with your daughter. And she was asking you to finish it.
Yes. And I suppose that was also an inspiration, because I've written quite a lot, and it kind of is just a part of a story that didn't go anywhere. But I suppose the fact that she wanted me to write something was also actually. Obviously, that was an inspiration to write something, because I felt, had I not done anything, then I would have been letting her down. So, and she kept nagging me, saying, "Oh, you must finish it." Well, I never finished it, but I started a new one, and I finished the story. So, and that would also have been, and I don't know if I've still got that manuscript. It's probably knocking around somewhere, but to be honest, I can't really remember. It would be interesting to reread it, but. I couldn't take it anywhere. I didn't know where it was going. It was quite detailed, but
it's maybe, who knows what the future holds. Maybe it's somewhere waiting for you to get back to it one of these fine days. I'm curious. You were into copywriting for a very long time, and from what I've understood, as far as copywriting is concerned, someone told me it's the art of selling with the written word. So you use the written word to make the sell.
Yeah, I mean, I would interject there. I'd just say, I think the thing with advertising is that there are no set rules, which is a good thing. But and there are lots of people that will espouse rules, but there aren't any hard and fast rules. I mean,
you make the rules as you go along.
Kind of, but although, I mean, the rules, I mean, as long as it's sort of reasonably relevant, you can kind of do what you want. But I mean, some people, I mean, I think there's amazing art in being able to convey something that engages people. I mean, and it's a great training ground for writers and as an artist, because it's a form of storytelling in a very concise form. And I think that, I mean, for me, the great writing is in advertising. It is really quite potent, and I mean, I suppose it started really creative copyrighted writing started probably in New York in around probably in the 1950s. There was I don't want to give you a history of advertising, but I'll just give you a very brief kind. There was a guy called what was his name? Bob Bernbach. It was Doll Dane Bernbach, and he was was incredibly creative and very good writer. And I suppose famous now for working on the Volkswagen campaign. And to give you an idea, I mean, it's an interesting story. I mean, when that agency was appointed by Volkswagen to promote the Volkswagen Beetle, it was a nightmare of a brief, because the Volkswagen Beetle was basically a car invented by Hitler. It was at the end, it was obviously after the war hadn't been finished that long, and they had to sell this car that Hitler designed that was didn't look particularly attractive. The Americans liked big cars, this was a small car. So I mean, how to approach anything like that, it was a nightmare. But the agency were brilliant in that they just kind of turned the whole thing on its head. And Bob Bernbach said, well, the way to sell this car is the fact that it's ugly. It's an ugly car, but it ain't half cheap. And that was the advertising strategy, and it was brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I mean, if you look at the work they did at that time in the 50s, it's wonderful. I mean, it's even today, it's very clever. I mean, for example, their television, well, they did wonderful press advertising and wonderful TV advertising. And it's quite sort of, it's mixed in that, some of it's very funny, some of it's quite serious. One of the simplest commercials they ever made is wonderful. It's a classic, a TV commercial with a Volkswagen Beetle, and all you see, it's the middle of winter. It's black and white because it's black and white TV at that time. You see a snow scene, and it's snowing like crazy. And I think it's shot really early in the morning, and all you see is this little Volkswagen starting. You hear the engine starting, and it starts, and then it just goes along a road, and you just see this thing going along through the snow. And nothing much happens, and then you just hear this voice that just says something like, have you ever wondered how the man who drives the snowplow gets to the snowplow?
What?
This man gets there in a Volkswagen. And that was it. It was just very simple, and it was just kind of, it was logical. It was just a very simple but quite powerful way of saying, this is a reliable car. And then they just sort of did lots of another one which was very different, was funny. It was I mean, they could never do it today probably, but it was like a funeral cortege of all these cars, and all you hear is the man who's died reading his will. There's a voiceover, and you see all these people in different big cars going past, all his family, and they're all extravagant cars, and they're, you see car after car, and he's berating them. He's saying, Jeff didn't know he didn't know the value of money. To him, I leave 1 cent, and all this stuff, and it's quite funny. And it goes to all these characters. Then at the end of this entourage of cars is a little Volkswagen Beetle, and he says, to my nephew so and so, who understood the value of money. I can't do the script. I can't remember the exact words, but he leaves his entire fortune of $100 million, and it was just very funny. It was just about the fact that anyone who values economy and value for money, who understands value for money, will end up winning. And it was just quite funny, and it just kind of conveyed the fact that this was obviously a very cheap car to run, and that was their entire strategy. And they just conveyed those ideas really simply. And in fact, some of the press ads talked about ugliness as well. I mean, there was one that there's amazing. I didn't even have a picture of the car. There was a very quite distinctive looking, shall I say, comedian called Marty Feldman, who you probably don't know. He had very strange eyes, and then he looked like a frog basically, and they had a full page of his face in black and white with his bulbous eyes, and I can't remember what the headline was, but it was something like, sometimes you don't have to be pretty to get somewhere, and it was just for Volkswagen. And it's just about, okay, we're ugly, but we're cheap. And it was just, and it was a very successful campaign. It ran, the agency still has the account, DDB still has that account all those years later. But it just shows you that I think creative copywriting is very powerful, and is a really good training ground for anyone who wants to get into creative arts and writing and filmmaking and stuff. It's really good. I have
a bonus question here. With your experience in creative copywriting, if somebody is watching this interview and this is a field that interests them, where would you advise them to start, knowing that what you say, that there are no rules, that you make them as you go along, and that almost what I'm hearing from you is that anything goes. You just have to know where it's going. And
well, I mean, if you want to get into advertising, I mean, you just have to get a portfolio together. If that's what you're asking me. And I did that with a guy at college, and we just that's how we got into it. Just you've got to get a portfolio of ideas. It's all about ideas and writing and so I mean, if you've got ideas for products and stuff, just write some commercials, write some press ads, and pester a lot of people basically. that's the way you do it. I mean, I mean, there's a very famous story about a couple of guys who became quite famous, and they got into advertising by, at that time in the 70s, they went to the most creative advertising agency. That doesn't exist anymore, but in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, it was an agency called Collett Dickinson and Pierce. They were CDP. They were a breeding ground for very well-known people who went on, became famous in their own right. And Alan Parker, who died recently, was from the film director, and various other people. Anyway, but these two guys who I just mentioned, who were students, dressed up as tramps, and I don't know why, and they turned up at the agency with D&AD, which is the Design Art Directors Awards, labels around their necks, and anyway, it was a very strange thing to do, but they got noticed, but they actually had some quite decent work, so they were actually taken on, like, as trainee, given a trial, because someone, obviously they were unusual and they had talent, so that's how they got into it. So people pull all kinds of stunts sometimes to get in, but that was in the days when you could do that. Maybe it's a bit different now, but basically you have to have ideas, ideas that resonate with the guys you're showing.
Wow, very nice. I see. What I get is sort of think outside the box, or just get rid of the box altogether and just let your mind run wild, and whatever comes, you can.
It can be. I mean, you have to be a little bit disciplined in that you. I mean, you have to be relevant.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
You can be relevant in really unusual ways. You know what I mean? Like for example, with that Volkswagen story. I mean, it was relevant, but it was relevant in a way that you wouldn't imagine. You obviously think of. You know, I mean, to say I'm ugly is not an obvious route, but actually, it was relevant because it was ugly, but it was ugly for a reason.
Yeah.
So I mean, you know, and so you know, it's about as you said, thinking outside the box is really kind of what it amounts to, I think.
Indeed.
But being relevant is important, obviously. But that, you know, it gives you a pretty big canvas, I think. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you. What would you tell me is the one thing that has happened to you personally that has had the greatest impact on you writing?
Yeah, well, that's probably well, getting personal. I suppose my wife got ill about 7 years ago now. I won't get anyway. She's in a wheelchair, and that's been pretty traumatic. And I suppose that's also made me want to write as well, because I suppose writing is a form of escapism. And you know, you can disappear into your own world. You've got control over it, and you know, it's a way of just kind of escaping. Yeah. So I think, you know, that has inevitably had an effect on me. Also, my last book is about disability as well, because it's my thriller, which I haven't mentioned, The Chairman, which is my recent book, is about and the idea came to me because of really Jennifer's position to some extent. I know lots, you know, they say you should write about what you know, and I know a lot about disability and spinal injuries. So so the protagonist in my recent book is a guy who's a successful lawyer who in 2005 unfortunately steps onto a London Underground train, and it's the train that is targeted by Islamist suicide bombers. So in my book, the entire carriage is killed apart from Michael, the main character, who manages to survive but comes away with pretty bad spinal injuries and ends up in a wheelchair. And that was the premise that kind of that I started with, and I had this idea, and I thought, well, this would be quite an interesting novel, because I've not read any books actually which feature a character who's in that position, a disabled character as a protagonist, and I think it'd be really interesting. And so I developed the idea from that, and so so what I thought was, well, we'll take this character and I'll make him into sort of this really interesting character who wants to sort of who seeks retribution, and it's slightly, you know, he's understandably has, you know, issues with coming to terms with his predicament, and he seeks retribution online, because I thought it'd be an interesting idea to have a character who, although he's stuck in a chair, he can still enter the world of the internet, and he can still spread his wings, as it were, and actually pose as an Islamist, and try and snare other potential Islamists in the hope that he will stop them in their tracks. And that's kind of, so that's what I thought would be a really interesting book. And of course it goes, and I developed the plot. It took me a long while, but you know, it develops without wanting to give too much away. You know, he gets more and more into this, and this kind of shambolic scheme actually gets results, but not the results that he necessarily wanted. And so he's drawn, so British intelligence gets to know about him, as well as a terrorist cell, and he gets deep into this, and it kind of and he can't escape it, and the more he gets in, the more, you know, he just can't get out. So that's the kind of the premise of it. And I think the book's written in two halves. The first half intentionally is kind of, I want to establish his character and all the sort of the problems and challenges that he faces as being a wheelchair user and transitioning from a able-bodied person to a wheelchair and all that stuff. And so I think that's quite important in understanding his mindset. And the second half of the book is really where the whole thing takes on a life of its own, where he can't stop it anymore. His thing that has started, it becomes a roller coaster, and he can't get off. And that's kind of hopefully the bit that is quite sort of compelling. And then I had an ending which I've spent a long time trying to configure, work out the ending, which I think actually is it does work. It's not expected. A lot of people say it is a surprise, and that comes as a bigger relief because I always want to write endings that are not obvious, and this one I think isn't obvious, but quite a nice way of finishing it. So I won't say any more on that, but so that's where the whole idea started. For my,
it's amazing. It's the current project that you're working on.
No, I finished it. Yeah, I finished. It's out there. It's out there now. Yeah, wow. The Chairman. Yeah, I published it in January as a paperback, and it was December as an ebook. It's doing well. It's
very nice.
I think I've got 56 reviews on Goodreads already, so it's doing all right. Yeah. So it's quite
And where can people buy your books?
Well, it's all through Amazon. I mean, The Chairman is available on Amazon, and also on. At the moment, I'm offering it for free as an ebook for the duration of COVID-19. I put it out there free as an ebook, and you can pick it up on Amazon, Kobo, Apple, Smashwords, and Nook, Barnes and Noble. And all those guys offer it at the moment for free, and I want to keep it for free for the entire year actually, and for the duration of COVID, because I want as many people to just have it, to gain access to it for free. Just to give it exposure really, because for me as a writer, I mean, if anyone does read it, if they could review it, that'd be great. Because reviews are like gold dust to us independent writers. So, but I mean, I'm sort of thinking about writing a sequel. A lot of people have said to me, because it lends itself to a sequel, the way it finishes. I mean, there's a natural conclusion to the book, but it can certainly move on. There's still characters there who can be developed, and there's a new story in it. But so I'm looking at the moment at trying to formulate that story. As I said earlier, it's the hardest thing. And I've got the first half of the book in my head. I know how that goes. But the second half of the book is eluding me at the moment. And I want to get that right. So once I get it in my head and I'm happy with it, then I can actually write the bloody thing. But I want to do that. I mean, I'd like to do that. The other thing I'd like to do for this book is, but maybe later on, would be to try and develop it as a screenplay, because it lends itself very much to a visual film. It's a very visual book. It would make a really good film.
Great idea indeed.
So I'll need to do that. But
more about this one, and we will be putting the links to the books with the interview so that people can access them.
Right.
And, where can people connect with you if somebody watches the interview and they would like to connect with you?
Okay.
What's the best way?
I'm on Twitter, and I'm in my Twitter handle is @Alex B Pearl, I think, is if I'm right in saying. I think that's right. And I'm happy for people to email me. I mean, they can email me. Should I give me the email address?
Yes, you can give the email address.
I'm happy for people to email me if they want to email me. My email is very simple. It's alex@apearl.co.uk.
Very nice.
And Pearl is as in, I always say to people, as in Pearl Harbor. So it's Pearl. Maybe not the best connection, but anyway. But people can. I'm always happy to get emails. I mean, I know people are funny about they don't want to put their email. I'm happy if you want to email me, that's fine.
Very nice. We'll put
you can pick up. Sorry.
We'll put the email with the interview. people can connect with you?
Yeah, and you know, it's a real bargain because it's free at the moment. So so you know, get in there while it's available and download it, because you know, yeah, I think people are generally quite enjoying it. So yeah, I'd be interested to have feedback if people do read it. Yeah.
This was very inspiring and very interesting for me, and I know that our viewers and listeners are going to love it too.
Okay.
I'm curious, is there anything else that you would like to mention that we have not been able to address in the interview?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I suppose there are. I mean, the other thing we haven't talked about, I suppose, are books that have influenced me. Like, it's been, you know, I mean, there are, you know, inevitably every writer will be influenced by books that they've read, and I suppose, you know, over the years there've been quite a few.
Yeah.
But I mean, as a child, I remember. I think my first ever book that I read it's a wonderful children's book, actually, written by, and it probably, thinking about it, probably influenced my first book, actually. It's a book by a man called Clive King, who people may not have heard of, but he wrote this book called Stig of the Dump, which is a wonderful book, actually. It's very beautifully written, simply written, but in that sort of style. You know, it was written, I think, in the 50s, but it's really charmingly written, and the story is great. It's about this little boy, and it's written from the boy's point of view. And there's something about books that are written through the eyes of a child that I love. I mean, and I suppose my book was probably also, you know, again influenced by this. But my first book, Sleeping with the Blackbirds, but that book, Stick of the Dump, is about this little boy who is living with his grandparents somewhere in the countryside, and he loves exploring their garden. And he goes down to the bottom of the garden and he discovers this rather unusual character who turns out to be a caveman who's jumped forward in time. And so there's a kind of a time warp happening. It's very clever. And but the thing is, he has this friendship with this little caveman boy. He's actually a boy his own age, and nobody believes him. They all think he's making it up. And it's a very touching story because it's all about sort of relationships and sort of childhood, really. It's really, for a book that's very simple, aimed at children, it's a rather moving book, and I enjoyed it. And as a kid, it was probably a book that, you know, made me read more, actually. So that was probably an important book. Stig of the Dump by Clive King. Great book, great kids book, absolute classic. And I suppose when I was a bit older, I used to read things like the Just William books, which are also in that same style. And that's why I suppose I like why I wrote that first book in the style that I wrote it in. It's kind of that slightly old-fashioned, whimsical style to it. And then I suppose later on in that same vein, I used to read books by the Jeeves books by P.G. Wodehouse, you know, of course, and I love those books. And then later on, you know, books like George Orwell's 1984, Animal Farm. There's more sort of challenging, sort of slightly political books were quite appealing. Yeah, and I suppose again, I mean, another book that was really influential, again from a child's perspective, was To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. It was a very powerful book that helped influence me, I think. So I think those are sort of key books that helped me along the way. So it's a combination of whimsical, humorous, and very kind of serious, actually, but also from the child's perspective. I mean, I think those sort of books have really been influential, actually. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Alex. This was very inspiring, and I'm so glad that we were able to do it.
Thank you very much. Nice meeting you. Okay.
Nice to meet you too.